In the gleaming interview room of Sterling Tech Corporation, a single father named Henry stood before a panel of cold, calculating eyes. His shirt was worn, the fabric creased from years of washing. His resume bore smudges from this morning's rain. The faces across the polished table regarded him not as a candidate, but as a failure already decided. But just as he turned to leave, the company's advanced security system erupted into chaos. Red lights flashed, engineers scattered. No one could stop the breach. Henry paused at the door, glanced at the screens, and whispered, "I can fix this." Could a man dismissed as worthless reverse his fate in mere seconds? And why would the CEO look at him with entirely different eyes after that single moment? The morning had started badly for Henry Collins. At 36 years old, he carried the weight of 2 lives on his shoulders, his own and that of his 7-year-old daughter, Audrey. The bus ride to downtown had been long, the rain relentless. Water had seeped through the corners of his folder, blurring ink on pages he'd carefully prepared the night before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with weathered hands that spoke of manual labor. His eyes, a soft blue, held the gentleness of a man who'd known profound loss. Once, he'd been brilliant, a prodigy in military cybersecurity, part of an elite team that hunted digital threats invisible to ordinary engineers. But that was before his wife's illness, before the medical bills, before the night sitting beside a hospital bed, holding a hand that grew weaker each day. When she died, Henry had made a choice. He left the career that defined him to become the father Audrey needed. He took odd jobs, fixed computers in neighborhood shops, repaired washing machines, anything that paid, anything that let him be home when his daughter needed him. But the money wasn't enough. The bills piled higher. The landlord's notices grew more urgent. Audrey needed new shoes. Her school required fees he couldn't pay. So he dusted off his old credentials and applied to Sterling Tech, one of the country's leading technology firms. It was a desperate gamble. His resume had gaps. His references were outdated. His interview clothes didn't hide his reality. The receptionist at Sterling Tech's front desk had looked at him with barely concealed disdain. Water dripped from his jacket onto the marble floor. She'd pointed wordlessly toward the elevator, her nose wrinkling slightly. Henry had ridden up alone, watching his reflection in the polished doors. He looked tired, older than his years, like a man who didn't belong in buildings this expensive. The interview panel consisted of 3 people. Clinton Davis, the vice president of finance, sat at the center, his suit impeccable, his smile sharp as broken glass. To his left was Elias Carter, the senior engineer, 32 years old with the confidence of someone who'd never known true failure. And then there was Adelaide Sterling herself, 34, CEO of the entire corporation. Her blonde hair fell in elegant waves past her shoulders. Her posture was perfect, her expression unreadable. She wore authority like other women wore jewelry, expensive, unmistakable, intimidating. Clinton had spoken first, his voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. Collins, your resume is interesting. 5 years of employment gaps, no recent certifications, and you're currently working as a—" He'd paused, squinting at the paper as if the words offended him. "A freelance repair technician." Henry had felt the familiar burn of shame in his chest, but kept his voice steady. "Yes, sir. I left my previous position to care for family, but my skills haven't diminished. I've kept current with—" "Have you?" Elias had interrupted, leaning back in his chair with theatrical skepticism. "Because our systems here are cutting-edge, military-grade encryption, multi-layered defense protocols. We're not talking about fixing someone's laptop." Adelaide had said nothing. She'd simply watched Henry with those sharp, assessing eyes, ice blue, beautiful and utterly cold. She'd glanced at his damp resume, at his worn collar, at the fraying edge of his briefcase. Henry had seen her judgment form in real time. This man doesn't fit. This man is a liability. This man is not one of us. Clinton had delivered the final blow with practiced ease. "Mr. Collins, I think it's clear that Sterling Tech requires a certain Caliber of professional. Someone whose personal circumstances won't interfere with the demanding nature of this position. A single parent with a young child. He'd let the sentence hang. Loaded with implication. Henry had risen slowly. His hands had trembled slightly as he gathered his papers. He'd nodded once, accepting the dismissal with the quiet dignity of a man who'd been rejected too many times to protest anymore. Thank you for your time. He'd been 3 steps from the door when it happened. The lights in the conference room flickered. A high-pitched alarm pierced the air. Computer screens throughout the office blazed red. People began shouting, running. Elias had jumped to his feet, his face suddenly pale. Clinton had grabbed his phone, barking orders that no one seemed to hear. And Adelaide had remained perfectly still, though something flickered in those cold eyes. Not panic. Calculation. An engineer burst through the door, nearly colliding with Henry. Ma'am, the firewall's been breached. We're looking at a massive intrusion, level 5 threat. If we don't contain it in the next 10 minutes, they'll have access to everything. 12 years of proprietary data, client information, trade secrets, financial records. Henry had frozen, his hand still on the doorknob. His brain, trained by years of military protocol, had automatically begun analyzing the scattered fragments of information. Level 5 threat, firewall breach, 10 minutes. He'd turned slightly, just enough to see the bank of monitors behind Adelaide's desk. Code scrolled across them in rapid streams. Most of it would look like gibberish to ordinary eyes. But Henry's eyes weren't ordinary. He saw the pattern immediately, the signature, the unique fingerprint of an attack method so rare, so sophisticated, that he'd only encountered it once before, in a classified operation, years ago, when he'd been part of a team hunting a digital ghost who'd penetrated defense contractors across 3 continents. I know this code, Henry had said quietly. Too quietly. No one heard him over the chaos. Elias was already at the computers, fingers flying across keyboards, sweat beading on his forehead. It's a polymorphic worm. It's rewriting itself faster than we can block it. I've never seen anything like this. But Henry had. He'd spent 6 months studying this exact attack vector, had helped develop the countermeasures, had memorized the subtle tells that revealed the attacker's next move. His body had moved on instinct. Stepping back toward the conference table, toward the screens, a security guard had immediately blocked his path. Sir, you need to leave. This is a company emergency. I can help. Henry's voice had been steady, certain. That's not a standard breach. It's military grade. Designed to look random but following a very specific pattern. If you let it run for 10 more minutes, it won't matter what your team does. The damage will be irreversible. Clinton had whirled on him, his face red with fury and fear. Who the hell do you think you are? We have trained professionals handling this. Get out before I have you thrown out. But Adelaide had raised one hand, a small gesture. The guard stepped back. The CEO stood slowly, her eyes locked on Henry's face. For the first time that morning, she was truly seeing him. Not his clothes, not his circumstances, but the calm competence in his eyes, the absolute certainty in his voice. You recognize this attack? Her voice was sharp, precise, no room for games. Yes. Henry had moved closer to the screens, ignoring Clinton's outraged spluttering. It's a technique developed by a hacker collective called Phantom Protocol. They mask their intrusion as routine system updates. By the time you realize you're compromised, they've already embedded backdoors in your core infrastructure. Your team is trying to block the visible threat. But that's just the distraction. The real danger is what they're installing while you're focused on the worm. Elias had stopped typing, turned, stared at Henry as if he'd materialized from thin air. How do you know that? Because I helped hunt these people for the United States military. Henry had said it simply, factually. No pride, no showboating, just truth. And if I'm right, you have about 7 minutes before they activate the hidden payload. After that, no amount of emergency protocols will save your data. The room had gone silent, except for the shrill wail of alarms. Adelaide Sterling had made a decision in that moment that would change everything. She'd stepped aside from the computer, gestured toward the chair. Show me. Clinton had nearly choked. Adelaide, you can't be serious. This man is nobody. He's lying to get access to 5 minutes, Mr. Collins. Adelaide's voice had cut through Clinton's protests like a blade. Prove it or leave. Henry had sat down. His fingers had hovered over the keyboard for just a heartbeat. Then muscle memory had taken over. Years of training, hundreds of operations. The knowledge that had defined him before grief had forced him to walk away from it all. He'd pulled up the system logs, filtered through the noise, found the hidden processes running beneath the surface chaos. And there it was, exactly where he knew it would be. A dormant program waiting for its trigger. Elegant, deadly, invisible to anyone who didn't know the signature. There, he'd pointed at a string of code that looked like random characters. That's not part of your system. That's the payload. In 3 minutes, it'll activate and begin transmitting your entire database to an external server. Your firewall won't stop it because it's been coded to look like legitimate outbound traffic. Elias had leaned over Henry's shoulder, his skepticism melting into horror. Oh my God, he's right. How did we miss this? Because you weren't trained to see it. Henry's hands had moved with surgical precision, opening command windows, typing strings of code from memory. I need administrative access, full system privileges, now. Adelaide had nodded at Elias, who'd entered his credentials with shaking fingers. Henry had immediately begun constructing what the military called a digital trap. He'd isolated the malicious code, surrounded it with quarantine protocols. Then he'd done something that made Elias gasp. He'd let the payload activate, let it begin its transmission sequence. But he'd redirected the outbound connection through a honeypot server. The hackers thought they were succeeding, thought their data stream was flowing freely. In reality, every byte they received was tracked, traced. Their location, their methods, their identity all exposed by their own greed. Done. Henry had leaned back. 3 minutes had passed, maybe less. The intrusion is contained. The payload is neutralized, and you now have enough forensic data to trace the attack back to its source. The room had erupted. Engineers crowded around the screen. Elias had verified every line of Henry's work, his expression shifting from disbelief to awe. The alarms had stopped. The red screens had faded to green. The crisis that had threatened to destroy Sterling Tech in minutes had been resolved by a man they'd dismissed as worthless. Adelaide had stood perfectly still throughout, watching, processing, recalculating everything she'd assumed about the nervous, rain-soaked man who'd sat across from her 20 minutes ago. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, not warm exactly, but no longer ice. Mr. Collins, where exactly did you work before? Henry had closed the programs, logged out of the administrative account, stood and stepped back from the computer as if it had never been his to touch. Defense Advanced Research Projects Division, Cyber Warfare Unit. I was part of a team that responded to sophisticated intrusions against military and government targets. We specialized in identifying and neutralizing attacks that conventional security couldn't detect. And you left that to repair washing machines. Clinton's voice had been heavy with disbelief and something else. Fear. Because if this man was real, if his skills were genuine, then Clinton's attempt to dismiss him looked not just cruel, but catastrophically stupid. I left to take care of my daughter. Henry's voice had remained steady, but something flickered in his eyes. Old pain, fresh every time he spoke of it. My wife was sick, then she was dying, then she was gone. Audrey was 5 years old. She needed me more than the government did, so I walked away, did what I had to do. Adelaide had turned to her assistant, who'd been hovering near the door throughout the chaos. Pull Mr. Collins's complete file. I want his full work history, military clearances, everything. Over the next hour, while Henry had sat in a small conference room drinking bitter coffee from a paper cup, Adelaide Sterling had learned the truth about the man she'd almost let walk away. His record was impeccable. classified commendations, successful operations that had prevented breaches most people would never know about, testimonials from commanding officers that read like fiction, and then, 3 years ago, an honorable discharge, personal reasons, family emergency, nothing suspicious, just a man choosing love over career. But Clinton Davis hadn't given up. He'd seen the shift in Adelaide's expression, sensed that his judgment had been wrong and that his position might be threatened by this unexpected savior. So, he'd done what frightened men often do. He'd attacked. "I've made some calls," Clinton had said, entering Adelaide's office without knocking. "Collins has been out of the field for years. He's desperate. How do we know he didn't orchestrate this whole crisis himself? Create a problem so he could solve it and guarantee himself a job?" Adelaide had looked at Clinton with an expression that could freeze oceans. "Are you suggesting a man with his background risked federal charges for corporate sabotage to get an entry-level security position?" "I'm suggesting we don't know what we're dealing with," Clinton had pressed on, digging himself deeper. "He shows up here, coincidentally on the same day we're attacked, with specific knowledge about a military-grade intrusion. It's suspicious. Adelaide, you have to see that." But Adelaide did see something. She saw Clinton's fear, his desperation to discredit someone who might expose his own inadequacies. She dismissed him coldly and returned to the conference room where Henry waited. He'd looked up as she entered, and she'd seen it in his face. Resignation. The expectation of another rejection, another door closing. He'd been preparing himself for it. "Why did you really stop working in cybersecurity, Mr. Collins?" She'd sat across from him, hands folded on the table between them, not interrogating, genuinely asking. Henry had been quiet for a long moment. Outside the windows, the city gleamed in the afternoon light. Towers of glass and steel, monuments to success. And here he sat, a man who'd lost everything that mattered. "My wife's name was Grace. Breast cancer. Stage 4 by the time they found it. She fought for 2 years. 2 years of hospitals and hope and watching her fade. Our daughter, Audrey, was so small. She didn't understand why Mommy was always sick, why Daddy looked so tired. I had a choice. Keep the job that paid well but required me to be gone for weeks at a time, leaving Grace and Audrey alone. Or be present, be there for every treatment, every bad day, every moment we had left." His voice had remained steady, but his hands had trembled slightly. "Grace died on a Tuesday morning. Audrey was 6. I held my daughter while she cried, and I promised her that I would never leave her, that she would always have me. So I took whatever work I could find that let me be home when she got off the school bus. That let me make her dinner and help with homework and tuck her in at night. The money was terrible. The work was beneath my skills. But I was there. I kept my promise." Adelaide had felt something crack in the careful walls she'd built around herself. She'd built Sterling Tech through ruthless focus and strategic detachment. She'd learned early that sentiment was weakness, that people would betray you if given the chance. That trust was a luxury successful people couldn't afford. But this man, this broken, brilliant, dignified man had sacrificed everything for a principle she'd forgotten existed. Loyalty, love, the idea that some things mattered more than career advancement. "I'm sorry for your loss," she'd said quietly, and meant it. Henry had nodded once, accepted the condolence with the grace of someone who'd heard it many times. "Thank you. I should go. I'm sure you have a lot to deal with after this morning. Actually, Mr. Collins, I'd like you to stay." It was then that everything had shifted again. Adelaide had called an emergency meeting with her senior team. Elias had been running deeper diagnostics on the system breach, trying to understand how the attack had penetrated their supposedly impregnable defenses. And what he'd found had turned the crisis from a disaster into something much darker. A betrayal. The access point wasn't external, Elias had said, his face ashen as he pulled up screens full of data logs. Someone inside the company granted administrative privileges to the attackers, These credentials belonged to someone on the executive team. The room had gone silent. Adelaide's face had drained of color. Henry, standing at the back of the room where he'd been asked to remain as a consultant, had felt his old instincts kicking in. This wasn't just a hack. It was espionage, corporate warfare, and someone in this building had sold them out. "Can you trace it?" Adelaide's voice had been deadly calm, the kind of calm that preceded volcanic eruptions. Elias had nodded, typing rapidly. The activity originated from a terminal in the finance department, accessed 2 days ago, multiple file transfers to encrypted external drives. He'd paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The login credentials belonged to Clinton Davis. The name had hung in the air like poison gas. Adelaide's eyes had closed briefly, and Henry had watched her absorb the betrayal. Clinton, her vice president, a man she'd trusted with the company's financial future, a man who'd sat in meetings beside her, smiled at investors beside her, helped build this empire beside her, and he'd been selling them out to their competitors. "Where is he now?" Adelaide's voice had been ice. "According to building security, he's in the server control room." Elias had looked at her with something like fear. "Adelaide, if he's realized we found him out, he could destroy everything, the backups, the redundancies. He has access to—" Adelaide was already moving, striding toward the elevators with Henry and 2 security guards close behind. They descended 3 floors to the heart of Sterling Tech's operation, the server control room, where every byte of data, every transaction, every secret lived in humming towers of processors and drives. The door was locked from inside. Adelaide's keycard didn't work. Clinton had overridden the security. Through the small window in the door, Henry could see him. Clinton Davis stood before the main control terminal, his expensive suit jacket discarded, his hands moving frantically across the keyboard. He was trying to trigger a complete system wipe, destroy the evidence of his theft, burn down the company rather than face the consequences of his betrayal. "Break it down," Adelaide had ordered the guards, but Henry had stepped forward. "Wait, if you force that door, he'll have time to execute the wipe command. Everything will be gone before you reach him." He'd pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen. "Give me 30 seconds. Adelaide had trusted him, again. Henry had accessed the emergency override protocols he'd noted earlier, the same administrative backdoors he'd used to stop the hack, with 3 lines of code. He'd locked Clinton's terminal remotely, frozen every command, stripped his access privileges. The vice president of finance had become powerless in his own control room. The guards had broken through the door to find Clinton slamming his hands against an unresponsive keyboard, his face twisted with rage and panic. "You can't do this. You don't understand. They offered me $20 million, $20 million for a few files. Do you know what it's like to work for someone half your age, to watch her make decisions? I should be making. I deserve that money. I earned it." Adelaide had stood in the doorway, backlit by the corridor lights, looking like a queen surveying a fallen kingdom. "You deserve nothing but the salary you were paid, and now you'll face the consequences of your choice." The police had come, led Clinton away in handcuffs while he screamed about lawyers and entrapment and unfairness. The irony hadn't been lost on Henry. Hours ago, this man had sneered at Henry's circumstances, had dismissed him as worthless, had tried to ruin his chance at employment. Now Clinton was the one being escorted out in shame, while Henry stood in the control room. Having saved the company Clinton had tried to destroy, after the chaos had subsided, after statements had been given to law enforcement and emergency protocols had been activated to change every password and lock down every system. Adelaide had found Henry sitting alone in a small office. He'd been staring at his phone, at a text message from his neighbor who watched Audrey after school. "Everything okay with Audrey? She's doing homework. Take your time." "Mr. Collins." Adelaide had entered without her usual commanding presence. She'd looked tired, human. The mask of the perfect CEO had cracked just enough to reveal the woman beneath. "I owe you an apology. Several. Actually, I judged you based on appearance and circumstances rather than capability. I almost let bias cost my company everything, and I almost missed the opportunity to work with someone truly exceptional. Henry had stood, uncomfortable with praise. You don't owe me anything, Ms. Sterling. I'm glad I could help. I want to offer you a position. She'd said it simply, directly. Chief of Cybersecurity. You'd be responsible for rebuilding our entire defense infrastructure, training our team, ensuring this never happens again. The salary would be substantial, 6 figures, full benefits, educational fund for your daughter, flexible hours because I understand you have responsibilities outside this building. Henry had stared at her. The words hadn't quite made sense. 24 hours ago, he'd been struggling to pay rent, wondering how he'd afford Audrey's winter coat. Now he was being offered a position that would change everything. I don't know what to say. Say you'll bring your daughter here when you need to. Adelaide had smiled slightly. The first genuine smile Henry had seen from her. I have a feeling Audrey would find our robotics lab fascinating. 3 days later, Sterling Tech had held a press conference. Adelaide had stood before cameras and microphones, her corporate armor back in place, and announced that a security breach had been thwarted by their new chief of cybersecurity. She hadn't named names, hadn't shared details, but she'd made it clear that the company's salvation had come from an unexpected source. That sometimes the most valuable people were the ones others overlooked. Henry had watched from the back of the room, still not quite believing this was real. Beside him, tugging at his hand with excitement, was Audrey. 7 years old with her mother's blonde hair and her father's blue eyes. She'd worn her best dress, the one saved for special occasions, and she'd looked at her father like he'd hung the moon. "Daddy, are you famous now?" she'd whispered, her voice carrying that pure wonder only children possess. "No, sweetheart, just lucky. Mommy would be proud." Audrey had said it softly, seriously, and Henry had felt tears sting his eyes because she was right. Grace would have been proud, not of the job or the salary or the title, but of the man he'd remained through all the hardship, the father who'd kept his promise. Adelaide had found them after the press conference, navigating through the crowd of reporters and executives with practiced ease. She'd knelt down to Audrey's level, which Henry noticed immediately. Not many powerful people made themselves smaller for children. "You must be Audrey. Your father has told me you're very smart." Audrey had nodded shyly. "I like computers, and robots, and building things." "Then you'll love the scholarship program we're starting. It's for children interested in STEM fields, engineering, technology, science. I think you'd be perfect for it." Henry had felt something in his chest tighten and release simultaneously. For 3 years, he'd carried the weight of providing for his daughter alone, making impossible choices, sacrificing his own needs for hers. And now, impossibly, someone was offering to share that burden, to invest in Audrey's future the way he'd dreamed of doing but couldn't afford. "Thank you," he'd managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "You have no idea what this means." But Adelaide had understood, because beneath her armor of success and control, she'd been alone too. She'd built an empire, but forgotten what it felt like to build connections, to trust, to believe that people could be good without ulterior motives. Henry had reminded her of something she'd lost along the way, the possibility of genuine human decency. 1 month later, Henry sat in his new office on the 14th floor of Sterling Tech Tower. The room was spacious, with windows overlooking the city where he'd once ridden buses to job interviews that ended in rejection. His desk held 3 monitors displaying system diagnostics, security logs, and real-time threat assessments. On the corner sat a framed photo of Audrey, grinning gap-toothed with her arms around her father's neck. The transition hadn't been seamless. Some employees had resented Henry's rapid rise from nowhere to executive leadership. Others had been skeptical of his methods, his unconventional background. But Elias had become an ally, learning from Henry's military experience, sharing his own expertise in return. Together, they'd rebuilt Sterling Tech's defenses into something truly formidable. The company that had almost fallen in hours was now one of the most secure corporations in the industry. Adelaide had changed too, subtly. She smiled more, listened more, stopped evaluating people solely through the lens of credentials and pedigree. She'd started a program to recruit talent from non-traditional backgrounds. Veterans, single parents, people with gaps in their resumes and stories behind those gaps. Some of the company's most innovative solutions now came from team members others might have dismissed. Late one evening, Henry was reviewing security protocols when Adelaide knocked on his office door. She'd changed from her power suit into something more casual. Jeans, a simple sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pinned in perfect corporate elegance. "Still here?" She'd entered without waiting for invitation, settling into the chair across from his desk. "It's past 7. Doesn't Audrey need dinner? Mrs. Chen is watching her tonight. Audrey's teaching her how to code in Python." Henry had smiled at the thought. Apparently my 7-year-old is now running evening lessons for our 60-year-old neighbor. Adelaide had laughed. A real laugh. Not the polished, professional sound she produced at board meetings. "She's brilliant, like her father. She's nothing like me. She's fearless, confident. She believes she can do anything." Henry had leaned back in his chair, studying the woman across from him. "I spent years trying to be invisible, afraid of being judged, afraid of failing. Audrey doesn't know how to be afraid yet. I want to keep it that way. You're doing a remarkable job." Adelaide had meant it. She'd seen Henry with Audrey during the afternoons when he brought her to the office, watched him patiently explain concepts, encourage her curiosity, build her up with every word and gesture. "She's lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one." They'd sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the city lights glittering beyond the windows. Then Adelaide had spoken more quietly, more vulnerable than he'd ever heard her. "When I interviewed you that first day, I saw what I'd been taught to see. Someone who didn't fit the mold, who didn't project success. I almost let you walk out that door because you didn't match my preconceptions of what valuable looked like. You gave me a chance when it mattered. Not soon enough, and almost too late." Adelaide had met his eyes directly. "If you hadn't turned around, if you hadn't noticed that code, if you'd left 5 minutes earlier, Sterling Tech would have collapsed. I would have lost everything I'd built, all because I was too arrogant to see past appearances." Henry had understood what she wasn't quite saying. The guilt she carried, the recognition that her judgment had almost cost her everything. "You learned from it. That's what matters. You changed. The company changed. Because of you. Because you let me help. There's a difference." Adelaide had smiled then, soft and genuine. "If I hadn't given you that chance, where would you be now?" Henry had thought about it honestly. Probably still fixing washing machines, still struggling, still telling Audrey that things would get better someday while not quite believing it myself. "And if you'd left, if you hadn't offered to help," Adelaide had leaned forward slightly, "I'd have lost my company to Clinton's betrayal, lost everything I'd spent 15 years building. We'd both be living very different lives. Guess we saved each other then." The truth of that statement had settled between them like a tangible thing. Two people from completely different worlds, brought together by crisis, changed by each other's presence. Not romance. Not yet. Maybe not ever, but something profound nonetheless. Connection. Understanding. The recognition that worth and value existed in places society taught us not to look. Adelaide had stood eventually, preparing to leave, but at the door, she'd paused. "Henry, I want you to know something. Every person I've hired since you came here has been someone who didn't fit the traditional mold. Former addicts rebuilding their lives, ex-convicts who served their time, immigrants with degrees that don't transfer, single mothers who left abusive situations, people with gaps in their resumes and stories in their gaps. Good. They're the best hires I've ever made. More loyal, more creative, more grateful for the opportunity, more willing to go above and beyond." She'd looked back at him, her blue eyes serious. "You taught me that. That day you walked into my office with your rain-stained resume and your quiet dignity. You taught me that the people we dismiss might be exactly the people we need most. After she'd left, Henry had sat alone in his office for a long time. Through the windows, he could see the building where he'd once been rejected, where he'd been judged and found wanting, where a panel of people had looked at him and seen only his deficits. He thought about Grace, about how she'd believed in him even when he stopped believing in himself, about how she'd told him, in those final painful weeks, that he was stronger than he knew, that he had gifts the world needed, that his worth didn't diminish just because circumstances had forced him to step away from displaying it. She'd been right, and now her daughter was growing up in a world where her father modeled a different kind of strength, not the kind that never falls, but the kind that gets back up, that keeps trying, that refuses to let rejection define worth. 6 months after that first chaotic morning, Sterling Tech hosted a gala for its employees and their families. The grand ballroom glittered with chandeliers and laughter. Henry had worn a suit that actually fit, purchased without panic about the cost. Audrey had spun in circles in a blue dress, her blonde hair flying, completely at home in this space that once would have intimidated her father. Adelaide had found them near the dessert table, where Audrey was explaining to another child the difference between artificial intelligence and machine learning. "She's going to run this company someday," Adelaide had murmured to Henry. "She's going to run the world." Henry had corrected with proud certainty. They'd stood side by side, watching the party, watching the employees who'd become something like family, and Adelaide had said, very quietly, "Thank you." For what? For not leaving, for turning around, for showing up that day even though you must have known the odds were against you. She'd glanced at him, her expression unguarded. "For reminding me that sometimes the things that save us come from the most unexpected places." Henry had smiled. I could say the same thing. Above them, the chandeliers sparkled. Around them, people laughed and danced and celebrated. And in that moment, standing in a room full of light and possibility, Henry Collins felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not just stability, not just security, but hope. Real, tangible hope that tomorrow might be better than today, that his daughter would grow up knowing her worth wasn't determined by others' limited vision, that he'd done what Grace had asked of him in those final days. He'd survived. He'd protected their child. He'd found his way back to himself. The man who'd walked into a hostile interview room with rain-stained papers and resignation in his eyes had transformed into someone new. Not because his circumstances had changed, though they had, but because someone had finally seen past the surface, had recognized that brilliance wears many disguises, that the most valuable people are often the ones we're taught to overlook. Outside the ballroom windows, night had fallen over the city. Lights sparkled in towers of glass and steel. And in one of those towers, on the 14th floor, an office stood with lights still burning. A desk with 3 monitors. A photo of a 7-year-old girl with blonde hair and her father's gentle eyes. A reminder that the distance between desperation and triumph can sometimes be measured in seconds. In the choice to turn around. In the willingness to say, "I can help," even when every indication suggests no one will listen. Henry Collins had made that choice, had turned around, had offered his help when it would have been easier to accept defeat and leave. And in doing so, he'd changed not just his own story, but the stories of everyone his second chance would touch. The employees who'd find opportunities because Adelaide had learned to look beyond credentials. The daughter who'd grow up secure and confident, never doubting her father's strength. The CEO who'd rebuild her company on a foundation of human value rather than perfect resumes. All of it because one man, dismissed as worthless, had paused at a door, had glanced at a screen, had whispered 6 words that altered everything. "I can fix this." Sometimes, that's all it takes. The courage to claim your worth when the world says you have none. The audacity to offer help when you've been told you're helpless. The willingness to believe that your gifts matter, even when they've been ignored. Henry had believed, had offered, had proved that the underdog doesn't always lose. Sometimes, against all odds and expectations, the underdog wins. not through luck or manipulation, but through competence, character, and the refusal to let others' limited vision define what's possible. In the ballroom, the music played on. Audrey laughed. Adelaide smiled, and Henry stood at the center of a life rebuilt from ruins. Surrounded by people who valued what he'd always possessed, but society had refused to see: his worth, his gifts, his extraordinary, ordinary courage. The rain-stained resume was framed now, hanging in Adelaide's office as a reminder, not of Henry's credentials, but of her own blind spots, of the day she'd almost made the worst decision of her career, of the moment she'd chosen trust over prejudice and saved her company in the process. Every executive who entered that office saw it, asked about it, heard the story of the single father who'd been rejected until he became irreplaceable, and they left changed, questioning their own assumptions, wondering who they might be overlooking, who might be standing in their lobbies with rain-stained papers and hidden brilliance, waiting for someone brave enough to look past the surface. Henry's story had rippled outward, touching lives he'd never meet, changing minds he'd never address, proving that one person's courage to claim their value could inspire others to recognize value in unexpected places. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Not just that Henry had found stability and success, but that his journey had opened doors for others still standing in the rain, still holding crumpled resumes, still hoping that someone, somewhere, would finally see them as they truly were: valuable, worthy, extraordinary, just waiting for their moment to turn around and say, "I can fix this."